Welcome again to another edition of Ask John. Question number 2 in Unit 2, John, refers to a quote from Edmund Randolph. And he expresses some concern about there's too much democracy. Am I correct in remembering that there were other people who used phrases similar to Randolph about this idea of having too much democracy?
Yes, you're right. There were two others that stand out. Many other people felt that same way, but there are others that are usually cited. The people who developed this question obviously were quite taken by the fact that Randolph's history of this period has just been acquired. The manuscript has been acquired by the Library of Congress, and so they wanted to draw upon Edmund Randolph. He wasn't really cited very much in the debate at the time, and subsequently he's not cited very much either. Two other people are, and the first is Elbridge Gerry, who is what would be considered a Republican with a small r at that time, which in the general scheme of things, looking back in English history and early American history, those people who were afraid of giving too much power to the central government. There are many writers, political writers in 17th century England looking at government, the nature of government, and how best to protect liberty. And those who were opposed to giving the king a lot of power would be considered these Republicans, let's say. And those who opposed governors in America, royal governors, and wanted the power to lie with the colonial assemblies, these are Republicans. And this persists after the Revolution. And so Gerry is one of those that believes you got to be careful. Yes, Congress needs some more power, but you got to be careful how much power you give to Congress. And so he's opposed to giving a lot of power to Congress until Shay's rebellion occurs in his home state of Massachusetts. And he goes to the Constitutional Convention, and his speech is highly and widely quoted in historical circles, quoting, saying the excesses of democracy. That phrase is very, very well circulated in history textbooks. But the other person who really comments upon the excesses of democracy is James Madison in his political vices of the system that we have both at the state level and at the federal level, the Articles of Confederation. And what Madison says, this is a essay that he researches and writes in late 1786, early 1787, on the eve of the Constitutional Convention, preparing himself for the debates that will take place in the Constitutional Convention. And in that treatise that he writes, he says that the states have been guilty of too much legislation. He says that the state legislation is multiplicity of laws, mutability, and lacking in justice. So these are the three concerns that he has. There's too many laws. They can be changed. And so because there's so much democracy, that most of the assemblies are elected for annual terms. And so you get one party that will come in and write legislation. And they get defeated the next year. And the new party in control repeals those laws and passes new laws. They then get defeated, and the original party comes back in, repeals the new laws and pass their new laws. And all of these can be endangering the end of government as far as Madison is concerned, which is justice. And so Madison does, in fact, refer to this concept of too much democracy, just as Elbridge Gerry does.
In your estimation, were the excesses of democracy more troublesome in the Revolution period or the Confederation period?
Well, that's an easy question to answer, and the answer is yes. And to use a phrase, whose ox is being gored here? Now, the English would certainly say the excesses of democracy were rampant before independence, and that was a terrible situation. It led to independence. It led to this terrible division of the empire. should never have happened. Whereas the patriots, the advocates for independence, they would say, no, democracy was wonderful. They would admit that there were some excesses that were there. People were tarred and feathered when they shouldn't have been, and people's rights were in danger. But this is a life and death situation that they're in the what might be a treasonous activity that they were involved in. And so the British would say, yes, excesses democracy before the revolution. The American patriot movement would say, no, they weren't. But after the revolution, after independence, during the Confederation, certainly you get a division of sentiment, and there are many people who believe that there were excesses. Madison is one of the strong advocates for that. Each state is really divided between two parties, one that's more amenable to the people, one that is sort of fearful of the people. Jefferson has a wonderful quotation saying, no matter what time you look at it, there are always political parties, and they always are divided between those who fear the people and those who fear government. And that's pretty much the way it was during the Confederation, especially after there was an economic depression that set in mid-1784, a very serious depression, and you get demands for debtor relief. Well, the creditor interests are very fearful of what the legislatures might well do. And so that's what we're talking about to a great extent when we're talking about excesses of democracy. Will the state legislatures, which are elected by a broad electorate and almost annually in every case, will they succumb to these demands for debtor relief that will somehow invade the rights of the creditor interest? Also, there were laws that were passed during the Revolution that restricted pacifists, people like Quakers or those who didn't want to fight, and laws against loyalists. Now, after the war, the peace treaty said that these laws were to be abandoned and no more prosecutions against former loyalists. Well, that wasn't always the case. And so you have legislatures who are violating the rights of the minority, and the minority happen to be creditor interests, wealthy folks, and former loyalists, and some religious groups like Quakers who had been pacifistic during the Revolution itself. And so these are dangerous elements here. When the creditor interests controlled the state legislatures, or at least controlled some part of the state legislatures, so that debtor relief was not possible. So, for instance, paper money is one of the debtor relief measures, that money was going to be issued and loaned to farmers to temporarily ease their financial burdens so they wouldn't lose their property. This is very controversial because paper money had been so tremendously depreciated during the Revolution, and creditors were afraid that their pre-war debts would be made worthless through worthless paper money. And so some of the state legislatures opposed this. In Maryland, for instance, the House of Representatives passed a paper money measure, but the Senate, in a very widely publicized vote, defeats the issuance of paper money. 7 states issue paper money during the Confederation period, 6 do not. In those states that don't pass debtor relief, violence takes place. So it starts in September 1786 in Exeter, New Hampshire. They try to shut down the government. The militia is called out by State President John Sullivan, and they defeat the insurrectionists. You get a burning of courthouses in Virginia. There are riots in Rutland and Windsor, Vermont. Riots in Pennsylvania, in Charles County, Maryland, in Camden, South Carolina. The biggest of these acts of violence was in Massachusetts, Shay's Rebellion. Now, the amazing thing to me is that so many people, so many revolutionaries, American revolutionaries, John and Abigail Adams, Samuel Adams, and many, many others, who were revolutionaries in 1776 because of the oppression of the British Parliament on them. Now they turn their backs on those advocating relief, the Shayites, and they say they are a dangerous element. John and Abigail Adams, they see the danger of these folks being oppressive and despotic in and of themselves. Samuel Adams is fearful of a counter-revolution if these Shayites are allowed to continue. It's only Thomas Jefferson who says that this is a minor matter, really. Now, he's off in France, and he says a little rebellion now and then is a good thing. Democracy is a good thing. People ought to be listened to. And when government goes too far, as government will always go too far, Jefferson was one of those who believed that government could not be trusted, but the people could be trusted. He said when people rise up, they should be recognized. The government should amend what it was doing, correct itself, and give a slap on the wrist to the rebels here, and thank them, in essence, for showing the government the right way to go. And so don't go too far. He writes a very quaint phrase to Madison, and he says in correcting for Shay's rebellion, the past should be commensurate with the whole. Don't go too far in correcting the problem that we're facing here. Democracy is not that bad. But Jefferson is really in the very small minority here in fearing democracy at this time. Many people have a sense that democracy is a dangerous element. Noah Webster wrote in 1786 in a newspaper article, I was a Republican, that is favoring a Republican form of government. I'm not anymore, because I see the danger of tyranny in the many, not just in the one. And I would rather be controlled by one person than by the tyranny of a mob. And so there is real danger of what is taking place in the states, and that they are veering toward a despotic rule of the people.
Well, thank you, John. Once again, on our website, we have Madison's Vices. If you'd want to pursue that further, it's available to you. And thank you for joining us.